Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our Monday edition here at Point of View, and this week we're going to have the Republican National Convention. We'll be talking about it as we go through the weekend. I know some of you will watch it. Most of you will not, if indeed what happened last week with the Democratic National Convention is any indication. So I'll get into that in just a minute. But a story that broke over the weekend, and we've got to talk about this first. Riots in Kenosha, Wisconsin, really took place yesterday, as there is evidence now that the Kenosha police officers, or officer, I have seen some say officer and officers, so I'm not sure, nevertheless shot Jacob Blake, an African-American man, in the back 7 times. You know where this one's going, because he did not follow police orders and continued to get into his car. After the shooting, officers provided medical aid, and Blake was then transferred to the hospital. Didn't take any time at all for protests to break out, as you might imagine, in Kenosha, Wisconsin. People gathered in the scene and in the downtown area. Protesters real quickly turned into rioters, got into fights with the police, started setting fires. You can watch 1 or 2 of these videos. I don't recommend it, showing rioters hitting a police car with projectiles, one hitting an officer on the head with a brick, knocking him unconscious, and then a Molotov cocktail being thrown, and a variety of other things happening. It is a sad commentary on the fact that the shooting probably, as far as we can tell, is certainly not justifiable. But whether it was or not, or whether we even have all the facts, it has, of course, led very quickly to a protest that broke out into a riot. The reason I always am a little bit hesitant is you have heard us on this program in the past talk about some of the misinformation that came out of, Michael Brown. Hands up, don't shoot, which never actually took place. So sometimes when you have these stories, the stories are breaking. There are things that aren't necessarily completely accurate. And in the midst of this, as you might have feared, since the governor of the state of Wisconsin is a Democrat, in his Twitter post said, while we do not have all the details yet, what we do know for certain is he is not the first black man or person to have been shot and injured or mercilessly killed at the hands of individuals and law enforcement in our state or our country. We stand with all of who have and continue to demand justice, equity, and accountability for black lives in our country. Just at what you need when you're trying to tamp down some of the rioting. The governor did what he could, I think, to try to fuel it further. We will continue to talk about that, and as we know more, we'll let you know. But I just, again, did not want to ignore that particular story. A couple more I'll get to in just a minute, but let's, if we can, set the scene for this week, because we do have, again, the Republican National Convention, and that actually convened in Charlotte. They had 336 delegates. Now, as I understand it, Kelly Shackelford was sharing with us off air what you did, and that is, rather than send all the delegations from the various states, they selected both the, well, and didn't have to select, they brought both the Republican chairman for that state, man and woman, so there's 2, brought 2 or 3 others. I don't know if Kelly ended up being one of those because he was going to be on the platform committee. They gathered today very quickly, conducted a roll call vote, and renominated Donald Trump as president and vice president, or Mike Pence as vice president. So that's where we are. And, of course, tonight we will again have a chance to hear from a number of individuals. Who might those be? A couple of surprises. First of all, no surprise that one of the first people to speak is Senator Tim Scott, the one African-American Republican in the United States Senate, and I suspect he will be addressing the issue of race. Also, Louisiana Representative Steve Scalise, you might remember he was the one that was shot on the baseball field and fortunately has been able to recover. A lot of South Carolina stuff, because also former ambassador to the United Nations, former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, will speak, and then Donald Trump Jr. will speak. But the real surprise to me is that Mark and Patricia McCloskey will speak. Now, you might say, who are they? Do you remember the pictures of the couple that were brandishing their guns at a Black Lives Matter protest outside their home in St. Louis? Remember that? Matter of fact, we sort of jokingly said that Mark McCloskey probably needs to take a National Rifle Association safety tip on how to actually handle an AR-15. He did not. Matter of fact, he broke almost every rule that we learn about how to handle a firearm. It may not have been loaded, but even so, you always treat every gun as a loaded weapon. And, of course, they're now facing felony charges. Now, in case you think they're Republicans, there's all the evidence in the world that they're anything but. As a matter of fact, he has been very much involved in various kinds of litigation, helping in most cases Democrats, and has been supportive of Hillary Clinton and a variety of others over these years. So it is kind of interesting that they're bringing him on. Now, maybe all they're going to do is make a very short speech or something that's already been pre-taped, but it was kind of one of the surprises there. So anyway, tonight is Land of Promise. Tomorrow night will be the Land of Opportunity. Wednesday will be the Land of Heroes, and then Thursday, the Land of Greatness. And we'll get into some more of that in just a little bit, which I thought was another surprise for me. Vice President's going to actually be speaking from Fort McHenry in Maryland, which was, of course, the particular fort that was under siege during the War of 1812, from which Francis Scott Key developed what today is our special anthem and all that we talk about, the Star-Spangled Banner. So anyway, that's just another point that I thought was kind of interesting. And one of the articles we've posted here is about the Democrats and the working class. And that is, Mark Thiessen's been on the program with us before, said that much of the Biden convention last week was an exercise, he says, in base mobilization. I not really had read that until he wrote that. He said there's a reason for that. A post-ABC News poll just before the convention showed that while 65% of Trump supporters say they're very enthusiastic about supporting the president, only 48% of Biden supporters say the same thing about the former vice president. And the enthusiasm gap drops precipitously when you look at two groups, younger voters and African Americans. Only 25% of voters aged 18 to 39 are very enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden. And interesting enough, a CNN poll showed that Biden's support among black voters is smaller than it was for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Only 68% of African Americans age 18 to 29 said they intend to vote for Biden, which is 17 points fewer as percentage points than Hillary Clinton. So again, part of what he says there is if you think Democrats are confident these voters will turn out, he says count how many times they urge viewers to make a plan to vote. An energized base doesn't need that kind of encouragement. And I was struck by that. We're going to take a break and come back a little bit more. But if you watch the Democratic convention, I know most of you probably did not, but if you did, there were many times when it keeps saying, you know, make sure that you vote, make sure you have a plan to vote, make sure you get out to vote. And I thought, okay, I sort of got that a few minutes ago, and here it comes again. Well, that's because they can't be assured that the enthusiasm for Joe Biden is even close to the enthusiasm people have for Donald Trump. That's interesting. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about base mobilization right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new study from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention documents what we already suspected. The coronavirus pandemic has adversely affected our country's mental health. Correspondent Alexander Nazarian summarizes the findings from a CD survey of 5,400 Americans. More than 4 in 10 respondents reported at least one adverse mental or behavioral health condition. More than 3 in 10 suffered from anxiety or depression. More than a quarter experienced symptoms of traumatic disorder. Many were using drugs or alcohol more heavily or even for the first time to cope with the epidemic. Now, many news reports accurately reported that 11% of the respondents said they seriously considered suicide, but that doesn't give the whole picture. If you look at the chart in the CDC report, you'll notice that more than a quarter of young people considered suicide in the last 30 days. All of these numbers and percentages represent higher levels of psychological distress compared to pre-pandemic levels. Anxiety symptoms, for example, tripled in their incidence compared to the same period last year. Even worse, the incidence of depression or post-traumatic stress disorder quadrupled. Columnist Jennifer Senior wrote about a Kaiser Family Foundation tracking poll showing a majority of American adults believe the pandemic is taking a toll on their mental health. More than 1/3 of Americans said it was interfering with their sleep. Also, 1/3 said they are overeating or not eating enough. All of this, she concludes, is causing a national slide into a sulfurous pit of distress. I believe the current circumstances provide an opportunity to provide our nation with true hope and encouragement found in the gospel and provided through individual Christian action and church outreach. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, first of all, I want to spend just a little bit more time talking about the Democratic Convention last week and what to look for in the Republican Convention. Then we're going to get to a couple of other issues. The whole issue of mail-in voting. Turns out New Jersey now wants to take an electoral mulligan, which is pretty interesting. The whole issue of the post-office war, and then we'll get into some of these conspiracy candidates and things of that nature. So there's a lot to talk about. But let's come back to this for just a minute, because in some respects, a national convention is one of the few opportunities to really give people a chance to help you understand the candidates and some of the key issues. But it is a zero-sum game. Every minute you spend talking about one issue takes away from being able to talk about another issue. And what I think we need to talk about for just a minute when we talk about the Democratic National Convention last week and begin to think about the Republican Convention this week is what was not covered. And that's why I posted this piece about the whole idea of the working class by Mark Thiessen, because he said this whole effort at base mobilization, he said, came at a cost. There was virtually no effort, he said, to win back the working class voters who voted twice for Barack Obama, but then defected to Donald Trump in 2016. Matter of fact, he says the reason Donald Trump is president today is because about 1/3 of the nearly 700 counties that twice voted for Barack Obama went for Donald Trump in 2016. Don't take his opinion for it. According to Nate Cohn of New York Times, Trump won because he flipped millions of white working class Obama supporters to his side. And so the thing that Mark Thiessen says is if you were a working class person watching this particular convention last week, You heard a lot about gun violence, racial justice, climate change, but not much directed at you. And he said the message that was heard was Democrats really are not interested in the support of working class Americans. And it showed up, he says, even in Biden's speech. In many ways, it was an impassioned, he says, an effective speech, but not a word about the opioid epidemic and the deaths of despair that are destroying families. Not a word about outsourcing of jobs that has decimated their communities. Not a word about confronting China, the country that unleashed COVID-19 on our country and decimated the economic sectors with unfair trade practices and a lot more. And he says basically Donald Trump understands this because if you notice last week, Donald Trump, you got to love him. He went to the birthplace of Joe Biden. That's Scranton, Pennsylvania. So he goes to where Joe Biden was born, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and says Joe Biden is no friend of Pennsylvania. Matter of fact, actually, he's your worst nightmare. I'm quoting against Donald Trump here. Biden supported every single globalist attack on Pennsylvania workers, NAFTA, China's entry into the World Trade Organization, which built China into a power, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Korea, the horrible, ridiculous Paris Climate Accord, again, I'm still quoting from Donald Trump, which stripped our nation of its energy and the so-called Clean Power Plan. And is it having an impact? Yes. If you go back in July, Joe Biden was ahead of Donald Trump by 11 points. As a matter of fact, it almost looked like there was no reason for Republican campaign to even think about going into Pennsylvania. The most recent poll shows Donald Trump within the margin of error. And so, again, one of the reasons that Donald Trump is sitting in the Oval Office is due to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so you can see that is the case. And, of course, then Mark Thiessen finally says Trump now has the opportunity to do what Biden did not, use his convention next week to reach beyond his base, make a pitch to the 10 to 15% of voters who say they approve of his economic policies but don't approve of him. Only in this campaign would you see this, but that is the case. Individuals that say, do you like Donald Trump? No. Do you approve of Donald Trump? No. Do you like his policies? Yes. Just, okay. But that's where we are. That is just where we are in this campaign. It is a fascinating statistic. And I've been doing this for a while, so I just don't see this very often because most people, if they like the policies, like the person. And there seems to be this dichotomy between, I really don't like him. I don't like his tweets. I don't like his comments. I don't like his personality. But I do like his policies, and if I'm a working class voter, I think I might vote for him again. So that's kind of one of those ideas of things that were not covered. Real quickly, before we move on, though, I wanted to also give credit to our good friend Gary Bauer because he pointed out that Joe Biden, when he was actually speaking on Thursday night, talked about this choice between darkness and light, but failed to address, according to Gary Bauer, two hugely important issues, one of darkness descending on us domestically and the other darkness that is descending on us internationally. So again, if I might quote Gary Bauer says, the domestic darkness is what descends on our cities every night. It covers the spectrum from ideologically driven rioters and mobs that threaten civilization to the vicious drug cartels, crime syndicates, and gangs that turn cities like Chicago into killing fields once the sun goes down. By the way, speaking of killing fields, let me just digress for just a second because it was last Wednesday. Where's that number? I want to make sure I give that number correctly here. We had the number of people that were killed in Chicago, and it was 21 people that were shot in Chicago, not over the weekend, just on Wednesday. 21 people on Wednesday alone in Chicago were shot. Now, not all of them died, but I mean, you just have to realize how much is not being covered by the press right now. 21 people, not killed shot during the weekend, shot just on one Wednesday. Okay, let's go back to us. So that's his point about the domestic darkness. He says the second great darkness, again quoting from Gary Bauer, comes from abroad. Communist China is rising economically and militarily. China is marrying technology with oppression in ways never before seen in the world. Politicians in both parties have watched cluelessly as 60,000 U.S. factories closed and millions of jobs were sent to Chinese serfs. While the cultural left, he says, has taught their children to hate our country, hundreds of millions of Chinese youth burn with patriotic passion and believe their day to rule is coming soon. So again, that is what I think sometimes just got missed in the whole discussion, and it was an opportunity which I don't think was that risky for either Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or both of them or maybe some other commentator to at least acknowledge the protests out in the streets that have turned into riots and say we're for law and order. But there was just no comment about it at all. Do you think we're going to hear about that tonight? Of course. As a matter of fact, I think Tim Scott's going to probably lead with that, maybe even saying, the concern about the death of George Floyd was justifiable. I can understand as an African American why there are protests, but I cannot justify these riots, and then goes into something like that. Sounds like I've already written a speech for him. But nevertheless, since I mentioned Chicago, just before we get into the mail-in voting, I did give you those numbers. 21 people shot in Chicago on Wednesday. And then, again, one of the interesting comments comes from the Chicago mayor, that's Lori Lightfoot, who actually has said, I wanted to make sure that my home is secure. And so she wants to make sure that no one can protest in front of her home, but you could protest just down the street. And according to reports, and I had to go back and check this one, not only is she getting heat for shutting down some of the protests, at least in her neighborhood, the only way they were able to do that is there is, at various times, as many as 140 police officers guarding the mayor's home. Now, again, this comes from people that are convinced that we need gun control, but that's for me because I want to make sure the police officers have the guns and protect me, but not for you. And, of course, this is also in the same city where you had this all these high-end stores down what's called Miracle Mile that were looted. And then you even had the Ronald McDonald House ransacked while some people were hiding inside. And, of course, you had all these various situations taking place. And, of course, one of the things Gary Bauer says, I'm sure every law-abiding resident in gun-controlled Chicago actually says, I'd like to feel just as safe as the mayor does. And then he says, I'm sure Mark and Patricia McCloskey of St. Louis felt the same way when they tried to defend their home from a mob. Now they're being persecuted by left-wing politicians. And when Gary wrote this, I don't think he knew that they are actually going to speak tonight at the Republican convention. So just as you've had a few of these Republicans last week that came on the Democratic National Convention in taped comments saying that they are not going to vote for Donald Trump, instead they were going to vote for Joe Biden, I think we already have our first example of somebody who most likely has always voted Democrat who's going to come on tonight. Maybe say he's going to vote for Trump, maybe not, but certainly say, I've learned a little bit more about how important it is to have a Second Amendment right to defend your home against people that intend you harm. Anyway, let's take a break. We'll come back. We'll learn a lot about mail-in balloting, and it doesn't look good, especially in New Jersey. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You know, one of the ongoing battles has to do with the whole issue of mail-in balloting. You've had some states that have been able to do this for many years and have maybe perfected this so that it has the same kind of security maybe as absentee voting. But when you throw this out to states that have no experience and they just start mailing out blank ballots, you have all sorts of problems. And the example I used until recently was New Jersey. More recently, I think the 12 12th Congressional District in New York's even a better example until I read the court documents and read about the court documents in New Jersey, and I said, nope, I actually maybe need to go back and change my commentary. It was worse than I ever thought. First of all, it's so bad in New Jersey, and again, this has to do with a particular vote in the third largest city in New Jersey. That would be Paterson. They are basically asking for an electoral mulligan. They're going to have to do it all over again. Now, how are they going to do that? Well, they decided that they will actually do a redo on the national day of November 3rd, and that's what they will actually do. But what is so interesting is that you had all sorts of ballots that were tossed out, about 16, in round numbers, 16,000 ballots, but only 13,000 were kept. So they threw out about 3,000 ballots because of irregularities. That number tends to be a little bit low. It turns out, according to Judge Ernest Capocella, that it was 24.29% rejected, or almost 1 out of every 4 ballots was rejected, which means this particular vote in Paterson, New Jersey, is just about as bad as the one that was in the 12th Congressional District in New York. 1 out of 4, just think about this, 1 out of 4 ballots was rejected. Now, what's so interesting is the judge there, who I just quoted from, was pointing out that 24.29% were rejected, but then went on to say, interestingly enough, that in the other municipal elections, the ballot rejection rate was only 9.6%. Think about that word only again. Only 9.6%. One of the things that has frustrated me for so long is the cavalier attitude that people have about voting. Only 9.6%. And if you've listened to this program any length in time, know that sometimes I compare your vote to money. Because after all, how you vote might determine your taxes, okay? So in some respects, I think your vote is as precious as your money. And imagine if a bank official said that we've got this ATM machine and it only has an error rate of 9.6%. I mean, you would shake your head that somebody would even say something like that. So again, this idea that, well, in the other cases, we only had a rejection rate of 9.6%, 1 out of every 10 instead of 1 out of every 4, shows you how unserious I think people are about voter integrity. Okay, we've learned a lot now from the court documents. I'd heard some of this before, but now we can verify it. At one of these apartment buildings in Paterson, New Jersey, the U.S. Postal Service didn't put the blank ballots into the individual boxes. They just stuffed a stack of them in the foyer. So you could go grab your ballot. It wasn't even put in your mailbox. Then you had, of course, court filings showing that people said they didn't vote, yet ballots were sent in under their name, you think? And as a result, oh, by the way, I might just point out that we actually have a city councilman, a councilman-elect, and 2 others. 4 people have now been charged with voter fraud. You know that thing that never happens? Okay. That will give you a little bit of an idea. And then, of course, this is the other part of it. Whenever Donald Trump brings up the Paterson, New Jersey example, what oftentimes Democrats say is, well, yeah, but we caught those individuals. Matter of fact, the governor, Phil Murphy, said some guys tried to screw around with the system. They got caught by law enforcement. They've been indicted. They pay a price. Well, excuse me, Mr. Governor, they weren't just screwing around. They basically were perpetrating voter fraud. So the more we learn about Paterson, New Jersey, the more we say, do we really want to do this nationwide? And I think any fair-minded person would certainly reject that idea. The one that catches me is 9.6%. Only 9.6%, Sure. Well, let's move on to some other issues because, as we mentioned on Friday, members of Congress raced back to Washington, D.C., one to actually try in the Senate to grill the Postmaster General. Now they're going to do that today in the House, or maybe they already have. But then Nancy Pelosi also wanted the House Democrats there so that they could pass a bill that would actually spend an additional $25 billion on the post office. And the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, testified last week in the Senate that his operation can't possibly spend $25 billion and make any difference there at all, because they already have decided that even the reforms they were going to do, they won't do, because they didn't want to have anybody complaining about that. So even some of the underutilized mail sorting equipment has been kept there because they didn't want anybody to accuse them of trying to make it more difficult. This, of course, is a post office that since 2007 has lost $78 billion. It is a disaster. And, of course, you still have the problem, as this article reminds us, of the fact that you have some of the states, Michigan and New York primarily, that are actually having deadlines for when you can turn in your mail-in ballot or your absentee ballot too late to begin to even come close to processing those through the post office. So what the Postmaster General actually did was claim that he would do the very best he could, Louis DeJoy, of actually prioritizing ballots over any other first-class mail. And most of these ballots used to be actually sent in under second-class mail, 22 cents rather than the 55 cents. But anyway, that's another one of those stories that I thought we would cover as well. And just before we take a break, let me just mention that my second article here is one on what I call conspiracy candidates. The other day, I saw a tweet where somebody said Laura Loomer won, and this is terrible. And I thought, I don't even know who she is, which I guess is a sad commentary on the fact that I don't pay attention to some of these what kind of wacko candidates that are believing in conspiracy. But nevertheless, she won a primary election in Florida with 42% of the vote. It is a heavily Democratic area in West Palm Beach, so there's not a chance that she will be elected to the House. But because of her belief in all sorts of conspiracy theories, it is quite possible that she could do a great damage to, if you will, the Republican label. But in August, you do have a Marjorie Taylor Greene who won a primary runoff in Georgia. And that is a Republican district, meaning probably she will serve. And a lot of this has to do with, do these individuals accept some of the QAnon conspiracy theories? Now, you know, I'm not terribly patient with some of these conspiracy theories, and so we don't spend just a lot of time talking about it here on Point of View. And especially when you try to dig into what QAnon is, this Q that began to spout all sorts of theories, if you go out, and I've started doing this, asking people, what do you know about QAnon? You get all sorts of answers. You know, there's pedophiles, that Jesus was an alien, that there were attempts to actually bring down individuals. This one here talks about, of course, Green talked about the 9/11 conspiracy, also believes that the Obama administration used gang members to assassinate Seth Rich, and just all these conspiracies that, are really hard to take seriously. But the sad reality is that when these individuals then win their primary, there is a natural tendency within your tribe, or in this case, within your party, to not say anything negative about them. And so as a result, because you have some Republican leaders, and of course some tweets by the president, a lot of people said this is not going to bode well for him in some key areas. John McCormick puts it this way: Trump's praising Green and Loomer is not the behavior of a president whose chief concern is winning re-election in November. He needs every vote he can get in both Florida and Georgia, and Green and Loomer are sure to turn off some swing voters. But it's not surprising that Trump, who himself promoted wild conspiracy theories, remember Ted Cruz's dad, remember Joe Scarborough, of course Barack Obama's birther, all that, doesn't do him any good. And I'm hoping none of this shows up at the Republican National Convention. But I was struck by the fact there was a very good tweet that came out by Senator Ben Sasse, who I think so highly of, who says that Trump's QAnon remarks will be partly to blame if Democrats retake the Senate. So there is some toxicity with some of these candidates. I would hope that some people in the party would call them out. A few have, by the way, so let's give credit where credit is due. Matter of fact, Mike Pence says, I don't know anything about QAnon. We don't believe in it. And just even the other day, you had the chief of staff of Donald Trump say, we're not even talking about this stuff. We don't even believe it. Good. We need more of that. Be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that next hour we're going to spend some time looking at a couple other issues in the news, and then we're going to have David Rubin with us. We're going to talk about the Middle East peace deal. Ben Shapiro wrote a piece last week, which I thought was very well done. This is a peace treaty that has been put together between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Another example of something that wasn't even talked about at the Democratic National Convention, other than at one point former Vice President Joe Biden tried to take credit for the deal, which, of course, didn't even pass the straight face test, but mostly wasn't even mentioned, and I suspect it will be very significantly mentioned this week in the Republican convention. So anyway, just wanted to mention that David Rubin is not as enthusiastic about the peace deal, say, as Ben Shapiro, so I wanted you to hear both sides on that, although I think it is significant, and he's not minimizing it. He just says don't expect much. With the Middle East, most of us don't expect much. And while I'm talking about our next hour, let me talk about tomorrow, because we'll have Paul Kenger with us. Professor Paul Kenger, and I'm going to post this piece from the American Spectator. Why not cancel Karl Marx? I love this because he said racism and anti-Semitism were second nature to Karl Marx, and yet the cancel culture gives him a free pass every time. And he says, of all the individuals out there, the dread dead white European male tag somehow just always eludes Karl Marx. Nor does he raise the needle, he says, on the left's bigotry meter, but alas, he should. He says Karl Marx was, after all, a bigot. His attitude towards blacks and Jews alone, not to mention women, would stun, he says, Stonewall Jackson. Ugly racial, ethnic stereotypes by Marx are littered throughout his writings, and then goes through some of those, which actually we can certainly see in this article that I will post from the American Spectator, but also is in his new book, which we'll talk about as well. And so he's asking, why aren't angry mobs staging sit-ins outside of professors' doors, insisting their busts of Karl Marx be tossed into the ash heap of history? Why do universities celebrate the man? And where's Black Lives Matter on this one? He said, well, we know the answer. Karl Marx is an icon to the left. Just like progressives call for tolerance and diversity, their calls for canceling and removing are highly selective, or more bluntly, highly hypocritical. So anyway, Dr. Paul Kenger will be with us tomorrow. Looking forward to that interview on not only the book, but we'll post this article just to give you a little bit of a sense on how this whole cancel culture applies very differently depending on who you're actually applying it to. Let's, just before we take a break, come back to one other issue. A lot more kids going to school, and Emily Gould has this really good piece. I'm just going to read parts of it because we don't have a lot of time. But she says, I didn't know I had strong opinions on things until things changed back in March. She said, before March 2020, if you'd asked me how I felt about video conferencing, I'd have shrugged and say, it's fine. But he says, my hatred now comes rather from having coached my 5-year-old son, Rafi, through virtual schooling in the spring, and I'm dreading the fall when his kindergarten class will be conducted, at least partially and probably entirely remotely. I'm eager to be proved wrong, but I suspect that for him and for my family, Zoom kindergarten might be worse than no school at all. Of course, Penedextra the other day had talked about, I think her oldest grandson is now going to go to kindergarten. Can you imagine trying to do pre-K or K kindergarten on Zoom? And he said to say that the virtual pre-K didn't go well would be an understatement. They talk about all these this breaking things, spitting, cups of juice on my laptop. I mean, it's just a disaster reading all of this stuff. And so she said, eventually we just scaled back to requiring Rafi to scrawl his name, a few letters and numbers before heading out to the park in the morning. And we sat down to the Zoom classes only if it seemed amenable. We had unrealistic expectations, too. Used to be able for the boy to talk to his classmates directly, to hug his classmates, to hold hands with them, and even to fight with some of them. And he's, of course, learning none of that in terms of any kind of socialization. But he says maybe the only thing Rafi, who's now in kindergarten, has learned is digital etiquette. And they said, I want him to learn that at age 5. No, we could probably learn that later on in life. And so he says, when I imagine the worst case scenario for Rafi, that's her son, and the fall, I see a kind of operatic tantrum that leaves the apartment trashed and everybody's nerves shot, like what happened daily in the spring. When I imagine the best case scenario, I see a kid who has fought and lost, who's gritting his teeth through a required task because we've promised him fruit snacks. Hardly horrifying, but definitely sad. Even our worst case scenario is a privileged one. A trashed apartment, a frayed nerves are nothing in comparison, she says, to what other parents are about to undergo. My husband and I can work at home. We can afford some assistance with childcare. But she reminds us that the huge number of parents who must work outside the home, parents who can't afford any childcare, and parents who don't feel comfortable managing a sitter's viral risk onside their own are in a far worse situation. But no one's situation is good. Kids like Rafi, who seem predisposed against online learning, are going to turn the fall into a battle. While I won't go so far as to prescriptively or preemptively throw in the towel, I am not sure how long or how hard I'm prepared to fight. Pretty sad commentary, if nothing else. It was in the Atlantic, and just a reminder of, and you can find it there, remote learning is a bad joke. Oh, yes, it is. Just before we run out of time, let me hit a couple of things. A couple of weeks ago, some of us noticed that Jerry Falwell Jr. actually took an indefinite leave from Liberty University. Oh, it's real clear now why he took that. Can I even get into all of this since it's a family-oriented show? But just think about bringing a third party into the marriage relationship and let your mind run, and you can pretty much figure out the rest. And so, again, it is a sad commentary that one of those individuals that early on candidate Donald Trump depended on was Jerry Falwell Jr., and we've been through this before. I hate to admit it, but back in the 1980s when Marlon Maddox was the host, and sometimes I was a guest host or a co-host, we talked about the televangelist scandals. This may be worse, and I'm being really careful about how I explain it, but nevertheless, if you have not seen the news, and how could you miss it, because I think it's front page on Drudge right now, so there you go, and I didn't want to ignore that either. We have riots in Wisconsin, we have sex scandals at Liberty University, and there's always something to talk about here on Point of View. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple more issues in the news, but also before the next hour is up, we'll have some time to talk with David Rubin, who really is just an outstanding individual, former mayor of Shiloh in Israel, whose son was hurt in one of these explosions, who then developed the Shiloh Israel's Children's Fund, which I think is just an outstanding outreach, but also an individual that from time to time we depend on to give us some perspective on what is happening in the Middle East. And with this particular treaty and peace treaty between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, it opens the door with other treaties with Sudan, Oman, Bahrain, maybe even Saudi Arabia. So it's significant, and we want to get his perspective on that. And as we always say, we are to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and we certainly appreciate our Jewish friends. And so David Rubin will come in and give us some perspective on that, and maybe just educate us a little bit more on how we can help those reaching out in Israel. So again, we have some information about him on the website. And then for those of you that stay with us for the third hour, William Marty will be with us. Fascinating Bible studies on every parable. Just a good way to get away from some of the news for just a little bit and learn some of the parables in the New Testament. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and I'm so glad you've joined us. In just a minute, we're going to talk about what is going to be happening tonight and this week in the Republican National Convention. Last week, of course, was the Democratic National Convention. And later this hour, we're going to be talking with David Rubin because we have this very insightful and somewhat significant peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Friday, we did quote some of the material from Ben Shapiro, who tends to be very optimistic about the fact this might even open up other normalizations of relations with Israel and perhaps Sudan, Oman, Bahrain, maybe Saudi Arabia. David Rubin, a little more skeptical, but we'll see where he goes on that. He is the former mayor of Shiloh, Israel, and as an individual who founded the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund after he and his 3-year-old child son were actually wounded in a terrorist attack. It's been a great outreach for children there in Israel. Also, the author of the book, Trump and the Jews. So we'll get into that with him later this hour, because if nothing else, it's a good example, as we're going to be talking about today, between, say, the Democratic National Convention and the Republican Convention. In just a minute, I want to kind of go through some of the things that were never mentioned in the Democratic National Convention, which I think will be front and center in the Republican Convention. As we go through the Republican Convention, maybe we'll notice some things that were not mentioned. And part of that is a convention like that is an opportunity to present your candidate and their policies in front of people, although not as many people are watching this virtual convention, but nevertheless, it's a zero-sum game. Every minute you spend on a particular policy or characteristic takes you away from talking about something else, and it was striking how many things were not mentioned at the Democratic Convention, which we'll get to in just a minute. But for our friends in Wisconsin, let's talk about what happened over the weekend, and that is riots erupted in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after it does appear now that a police officer or officers, I'm still unsure about that, shot Jacob Blake, an African-American man, in the back 7 times after he did not follow police orders and continued to get into his car. After the shooting, officers provided medical aid, and he was then taken to the hospital. And as you might imagine, it did not take long for protests to start. People on the scene and in downtown, you can watch some of the videos which are available showing rioters hitting a squad car with projectiles, hitting an officer in the head with a brick, which knocked him unconscious, a Molotov cocktail. Protesters broke into a government building, smashed windows, and you had the governor then later on saying, while we do not have all the details yet, what we do know for certain is he was not the first black man or person to have been shot or injured or mercilessly killed at the hands of individuals in law enforcement in our state or our country. Nothing that he was doing there was trying to tamp down some of that, but we'll continue to watch that if nothing else. And it's one more of those issues that will be front and center this week, as we also, of course, begin to focus some time and attention on the Republican National Convention. And that is today. You have the 336 delegates convened in Charlotte. conducted a roll call vote. They were given proxies so that you had the male and female head of each Republican Party in each state with additional and other delegates so that they could actually have a small number who could then actually formally renominate Donald Trump as president and formally renominate Mike Pence as vice president. And tonight there will be an opportunity for those of you that will tune in, and I suspect many of you will not, because as we watched during the Democratic National Convention, viewership dropped significantly. But if you do tune in, first of all, for our listeners out in South Carolina, quite a bit. First of all, we'll have South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. I am virtually certain that he's going to be addressing the issue of racial tensions and racial issues and racial reconciliation. Louisiana Representative Steve Scalise, you might remember the one that was shot on the baseball field. Another ode to South Carolina, and that is the former governor and now the former ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, will be speaking. And Donald Trump Jr. will be speaking. And then some surprises. To me, the biggest surprises is that they will actually have tonight, I assume it's just taped, Mark and Patricia McCloskey. Might say, who are they? Well, if you remember, they were the couple out there in their home in St. Louis. When various people broke down their gate, came on their property, they started brandishing their guns. Now, as I said before, Mark McCloskey really needs to go through an NRA safety seminar to learn how to not point your weapon in all sorts of different directions like he did. I'm not sure it was loaded or unloaded, but you assume every gun is loaded. That's the first thing you learn there. But nevertheless, did not expect them to be speaking. As you know, they were actually trying to force the various protesters off of their lawn, and they now face felony charges. The McCloskeys pretty much are Democrats, have supported Democratic candidates. He's an attorney working in tort law, if I remember right. But nevertheless, speaking there tonight, so it'll be interesting to see what they have to say. So that tonight is the kind of the theme, Land of Promise. Tuesday night will be Land of Opportunity. Wednesday will be the Land of Heroes, and then Thursday will be the Land of Greatness. A couple other surprises. Vice President Mike Pence will actually be delivering his address on Wednesday from Fort McHenry, which is in Maryland, for those of you that don't know. And that is, of course, the fort that was fired upon during the War of 1812, while Francis Scott Key watched and eventually gave us our national anthem, our Star-Spangled Banner. Anyway, that will be interesting to see. One of the great challenges for the Trump administration is the economy, because we have about 10 weeks before the election. And this particular article in The Hill says that any signs of a strong recovery certainly could bolster Donald Trump's case that he's been a good steward of the economy. You'd have to say that perhaps one of his best arguments for being reelected is, look what I've done for the economy. But of course, it was completely destroyed by the coronavirus and the lockdowns. And so we'll see where that goes, because if you've looked at other presidential campaigns and other elections, sad to say, and I don't always agree with this, people oftentimes vote with their pocketbook. They should vote for other issues beside their pocketbook, but the reality is that oftentimes that is the case. And one of the key determinants of whether or not someone in the Oval Office will be reelected is how they're doing. No president in the post-World War II era has ever been given a second term when the unemployment rate is in the double digits. That's where it is right now, so it will be interesting to see how that plays out. We come back from the break. I want to talk about one of the articles I've posted here. The convention shows Democrats have ceded the working class to Republicans, and that, I think, is a very good piece by Mark Thiessen. It'll help us understand why the Biden campaign and convention focused on one issue but also ignored another, which I am convinced is not going to be ignored by the Trump campaign and the Republican convention. So we'll come back and talk about that. And I think we'll have enough time to also at least give you an update on this mail-in voting fiasco that unfolded in New Jersey, which again illustrates why we have to be really thinking seriously about whether we want to go to mail-in ballots. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new study from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention documents what we already suspected. The coronavirus pandemic has adversely affected our country's mental health. Correspondent Alexander Nazarian summarizes the findings from a CD survey of 5,400 Americans. More than 4 in 10 respondents reported at least one adverse mental or behavioral health condition. More than 3 in 10 suffered from anxiety or depression. More than a quarter experienced symptoms of traumatic disorder. Many were using drugs or alcohol more heavily or even for the first time to cope with the epidemic. Now, many news reports accurately reported that 11% of the respondents said they seriously considered suicide, but that doesn't give the whole picture. If you look at the chart in the CDC report, you'll notice that more than a quarter of young people considered suicide in the last 30 days. All of these numbers and percentages represent higher levels of psychological distress compared to pre-pandemic levels. Anxiety symptoms, for example, tripled in their incidence compared to the same period last year. Even worse, the incidence of depression or post-traumatic stress disorder quadrupled. Columnist Jennifer Senior wrote about a Kaiser Family Foundation tracking poll showing a majority of American adults believe the pandemic is taking a toll on their mental health. More than 1/3 of Americans said it was interfering with their sleep. Also, a third said they are overeating or not eating enough. All of this, she concludes, is causing a national slide into a sulfurous pit of distress. I believe the current circumstances provide an opportunity to provide our nation with true hope and encouragement found in the gospel and provided through individual Christian action and church outreach. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's take a moment and look back to the Democratic National Convention last week and see what was ignored, and look ahead to the Republican Convention. And when we're talking about this, obviously we focus most of our time and attention on the presidential election, the Biden-Harris ticket and the Trump-Pence ticket. But let's remember that we have 35 Senate elections taking place as well, 33 regular and 2 special Senate elections, probably the most we've ever had, in which we actually have 35 different races for Senate, 435 races for the House of Representatives, 13 governor's races, and 86 out of the 99 legislative chambers will have the elections as well. So whether you look at federal, state, or local, a lot of elections and a lot of candidates wanting your vote. Now, Mark Thiessen, in one of the articles I've posted here, talks about the whole idea of the working class, but he begins by actually saying that the convention last week, the Biden convention as he calls it, was really an exercise in base motivation and mobilization. And that is a poll that was done recently by Post and ABC News concluded that about 65% of Trump supporters say they're very enthusiastic about supporting the president, but only 48% of Biden supporters say the same thing. And if you look at the enthusiasm gap, it's even more significant with 2 key constituencies that former Vice President Joe Biden needs to win: younger voters and African Americans. Only 25% of voters age 18 to 39 are very enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden. If you look at a most recent CNN poll, Biden's support among black voters is smaller for him than it was for Hillary Clinton in 2016. We talked about that last week with one of my guests, by the way. Only 68% of African Americans age 18 to 29 say they intend to vote for Biden. That's 17 points fewer than Hillary Clinton got 4 years ago. So the point is, there was a lot during the Democratic convention about make your plan to vote, get out to vote. They had special announcements, and after a while it was very obvious that they are concerned about voter mobilization, because it's not who says in a poll who they're going to vote for, it's who goes to the polls or who gets an absentee ballot or fills out a mail-in ballot to actually vote. And so Mark Thiessen says the focus on base mobilization came at a cost, because there was virtually no effort, he says, to win back the working class voters who twice voted for Barack Obama, but then defected to Donald Trump in 2016. Matter of fact, again, if you look at the numbers, about a third of the nearly 700 counties that twice voted for Barack Obama in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. One individual writing for the New York Times said Trump won because he flipped millions of white working class Obama supporters to his side. And really, the point that Mark Thiessen is saying is if you're watching the convention last week and you are part of the working class voter, you heard a lot about gun violence, racial justice, climate change, but not much directed at you. And the message almost seemed to be the Democratic Party is not interested in your support. Even when you look at the speech by Joe Biden on Thursday night, Mark Thiessen says not a word about the opioid epidemic and the deaths of despair that are destroying families, not a word about the outsourcing of jobs that has decimated their communities, not a word about confronting China, the country that unleashed COVID-19 in our country and has decimated part of our economic sector because of unfair trade practices, and on and on and on. And just to drive that point home, Donald Trump, gotta love him, he said, let me just go to Pennsylvania. So he goes to the birthplace of Joe Biden, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and says, this is what he said last week. I'm quoting now from President Donald Trump. Joe Biden is no friend of Pennsylvania. He's actually your worst nightmare. Again, quoting from Donald Trump. Biden supported every single globalist attack on Pennsylvania workers, NAFTA, China's entry into the World Trade Organization, which built China into a power, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Korea, the horrible, ridiculous, this again, Donald Trump's comments, ridiculous Paris Climate Accord, which stripped our nation of energy, and so-called Clean Power Plan. Now, you might wonder, why did Donald Trump go to Pennsylvania? Well, first of all, because he won in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, you figure he might go there. But you might think the campaign wouldn't necessarily think that was a good idea, because back in July, Joe Biden had an 11-point lead over Donald Trump. Not any longer. The most recent poll shows that Trump is within the margin of error. And so, again, what you're perhaps going to see this week is Donald Trump trying to do what Biden did not, and that is to reach beyond his base and make a pitch to the 10 to 15% of voters who, and this is just amazing, say they approve of his economic policies but don't approve of him. You don't see that very often. Again, these are people that says, I really don't like Donald Trump. I don't like his tweets. I don't like what he says. But I do like his policies, and to maybe appeal to those individuals to vote for him again. And if they do, and if those individuals that are in the African-American constituency don't vote for Joe Biden, maybe you do see a re-election of Donald Trump. Just before we take a break, though, let me take one more issue on the table that deserves some attention, and that is a piece having to do with the fact that New Jersey now is asking for an electoral mulligan. If you listen to this program, you know that I've talked about one of the concerns about mail-in voting can be seen in the state's third largest city in New Jersey, that is Paterson, New Jersey, where there were a number of individuals that actually were engaged in fraud. As a matter of fact, 4 men, including a city councilman and a councilman-elect, were charged with voter fraud. You know, that thing that supposedly never happens. And as a result, now they want a redo. They want a mulligan, so that will happen November 3rd. Now, interestingly enough, the judge in that case, Ernest Capocella, points out that of all the ballots cast in that election, 24.29% were rejected. I stand to be corrected. Back then, I was talking about 16,000 ballots, and 13,000 were accepted, but 3,000 were thrown out. By the time it was done, they throw out 1 out of every 4. Just think about this. Now, that is basically just like what we had in the 12th Congressional District in New York, where 25% of those ballots were thrown out. Can you see the problem here in New York and New Jersey? One other point, just before we take a break. I just have to mention this. The judge, though, said even though 24%, almost 25%, were actually thrown out, in the other municipal elections, the overall ballot rejection rate was only 9.6%. I love that, only 9.6%. You, if you've listened to this program, sometimes hear me suggest that a ballot is kind of like money. I mean, really, who you vote for, who you elect in office may even determine your taxes and those kinds of things. And can you imagine if somebody in the bank said, well, here's an ATM machine over here, and it has an error only of 9.6%. And you go, only? Where's the only here? You mean sometimes it gives me too little money, gives me too much money, doesn't give credit, but it's only 1 out of every 10 times. It just shows you sort of the cavalier attitude that some people have about voting. And now we have the court records to remind us of how bad it's become. At one apartment building there in Paterson, New Jersey, the U.S. Postal Service didn't even put the ballots into the individual mailboxes. They just stacked them on the foyer there so anybody could grab them. And the court records now show that there were people who said they did not vote, but nevertheless their ballots were sent in under their names. And the response that came from the governor of New Jersey, that would be Phil Murphy, was, well, come on, you guys, this is okay. Matter of fact, some of them were saying, look, this was positive because, as the governor said, some people tried to screw around with the system. They got caught by law enforcement. They've been indicted. They paid a price. I want to say they didn't just screw around with the system. They actually changed the ballots. They were engaged in voter fraud, and they invalidated the votes of other individuals. Imagine if you went to your polling place that day to vote and say, well, no, you've already voted. No, I didn't. Somebody grabbed your ballot and voted for you. And again, this very cavalier attitude towards mail-in voting will solve the problems. No big deal. We caught the perpetrators. First of all, the fact is now 4 of these individuals are charged with voter fraud. And now maximize that, not just to look at New Jersey in one of these city council races, not just maybe at a congressional race, the 12th congressional race in New York. Now expand that to the rest of the country. We're going to move from what we had last time, about 33 million absentee ballots and vote-in and mail-in ballots with states that have done this in the past. And now they think it might be 80 million. And the impact that that could have, especially with states that have never developed the safeguards that some of the other states have, this could be a disaster. Anyway, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about this peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates with David Rubin. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Last week, we spent a little bit of time talking about the peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, if for no other reason than it really was not mentioned at all in the Democratic National Convention. This week is the Republican National Convention. I'm sure it will be a center-focused issue, but nevertheless, we wanted to get some more perspective on what it means, and I thought it would be great if we could have a chance to talk with David Rubin, who is the former mayor of Shiloh in Israel, author of the book Trump and the Jews, and founder and president of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, which he established back when his 3-year-old son was wounded in a terror attack. It's such an outstanding organization. We have a link to that on our website, pointofview.net. And David Rubin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. Good to be with you.
I watched you on one of these interview shows in which you said, now don't make too much out of this peace deal, so we'll try not to. But at the same time, I still think it's pretty significant that you can have Israel and the United Arab Emirates, including formal normalization of relations and the possibility that this might open the door for something else. So how should we think about this peace deal that has been negotiated?
Well, first of all, point of information. I'll just let you know that the heading that's after that interview on Fox News, which said it said don't make too much out of this. It actually was taken out of context.
Ah, okay.
Because the context, because I went on to say that I was answering a question that was asked, which was the Israeli concession about sovereignty
right? Okay,
a big deal? And I said, don't read too much into it.
Okay.
Well,
that's
and then
good.
I went on to say that this peace agreement is a huge deal.
Good. That's what I was thinking. I thought maybe I'm making a mistake here. Good. You're helping me out.
I was misquoted.
Yes.
I was misquoted.
But that's important because, I've seen that there have been always people trying to bring about some kind of peace in the Middle East. We had a roundtable discussion on Friday, and some of my co-hosts were taking us all the way back to Jimmy Carter and things like that, and Anwar Sadat and all the rest. But I do believe that the fact that the Democratic National Convention didn't really bring it up, although I did hear the former Vice President Joe Biden try to take credit for the deal, which I had trouble dealing with. But this does seem pretty significant and historic, and in light of what you just said in terms of recognizing the right of Israel to actually be there in the first place. But tell us more, if you might.
Okay, well, look, I think that number one, we're talking about the first peace agreement between Israel and any Arab country in the past 26 years, and that is indeed a big deal.
Sure,
the Arab countries are usually afraid to go out on a limb and to establish full normalization of relations with Israel. So I think that's very important. It's very important for Israel and certainly for the United Arab Emirates, which will be benefiting from that relationship with Israel, from Israel's technology, Israel's knowledge and industry. There's so many areas in which they can benefit, as well as getting a partner to help them to defend themselves against Iran. Because it should be pointed out that the Islamic regime in Iran, which is an extreme Shiite Muslim regime, has been trying to get a nuclear bomb. And they've been trying for a couple of decades now, and they've been making a lot of progress with the help of President Obama and Joe Biden, who sent $1.7 billion in cash in suitcases,
yes,
or actually on crates, that they shipped to Iran in order to get them to sign that horrible peace deal. That was the horrible deal. That was a nuclear deal, a deal that was supposed to stop them from getting a nuclear bomb, and it does nothing of the sort. And all it did was give them a lot of money, with which to use towards their nuclear research program and towards their support for terrorism. So, that has to be pointed out clearly. So Joe Biden, if he wishes to show that he is a friend of Israel or that he deserves any sort of credit for any of President Trump's accomplishment, well, that's all nonsense. Everyone in Israel knows that there is a reason why near the end of Obama's second term, about 4% of Israelis said that he was pro-Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
It's not an accident. It comes from something, and also comes from President Trump's accomplishments.
I might just mention that Ben Shapiro the other day uses arguments that sometimes I use, and that is you can always tell how historic something is by who opposes it. Iran opposes it. Turkey opposes it. The Palestinian Authority. So if nothing else, that shows you it was pretty significant. And it goes back to the point you just made, and I think we need to emphasize it once again. Many of these countries up until now might not have worked with Israel, but they recognize with the threat from Iran and that radical Shiite view and that desire to control the region, they better work together. And so in some respects, what maybe seemed for some people unthinkable a couple of years ago is starting to develop. And so isn't it at least theoretically possible that there might be other peace deals besides just the United Arab Emirates?
Oh, absolutely. I should point out that, and I did point this out, in fact, in my book, Trump and the Jews, which was completed a couple of years ago and published almost 2 years ago, that President Trump facilitated these relationships, and he facilitated the relationships with Israel and the countries in the Persian Gulf. They have been going on for a couple of years now, quite intensively. They've been covert. They haven't been publicized that much. And in my book, Trump and the Jews, spoke about it in some detail because I thought it was significant, and I thought that it was a harbinger of what was going to be coming. And those relationships were not just with the United Arab Emirates, and have been with Saudi Arabia. They have been with Bahrain and Oman. And so these are the countries in the Persian Gulf, Arab Muslim countries, that have been cooperating with Israel covertly for some time. What the UAE announcement does, and it's a big thing, is that it makes everything official. It takes the relationship with Israel out of the closet. There is no longer a secret, covert relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Now it's out in the open, and because of that, a lot of the businesses that hesitated to have cooperative relationship with Israel in the Arab world now will have a little bit more courage to go forward with those relationships. And as far as facing Iran, it definitely will give the United Arab Emirates a little bit of courage, knowing that they have Israel's military prowess and intelligence expertise on their side.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with David Rubin. And let me encourage you to go to his website, because I do want to feature what I think is such an outstanding outreach, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. But let me also, since we mentioned the book Trump and the Jews, it came out 2 years ago, and it's in hardcover, and it's still available in hardcover and Kindle in case you'd like to get a copy of it, and about 200 plus pages that really helps you understand that ever since the election of Donald Trump, there have been some very positive actions. Maybe, in fact, when we come back, might even talk about moving the embassy. Last time I was in Israel and made sure I got my picture in front of the new embassy there in Jerusalem. And so we'll talk about that and just the failed idea in the past of the only way you're going to get peace is to bring lots of pressure on Israel, maybe giving up land for peace and all the rest. And I think this sets that aside as well. So not only looking at the peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, but what could happen with Sudan, Oman, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and some others. And so if you'd like to know a little bit more about David Rubin, you'd like to understand more about how Donald Trump and the Jewish people have developed quite a kinship there in Israel, we'll get into some of that after the break. And again, if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. And David Rubin with us, former mayor of Shiloh in Israel, and also, of course, founder and president of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, which he established after the wounding of his 3-year-old son. So let's take a break. We will continue our conversation with him right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with David Rubin. And again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. We'll focus on that for just a minute. David, you know, one of the things that's so interesting is if you go to some of these rallies, and we have with a microphone, and we ask, what do you appreciate about President Trump? And the number one answer usually is the federal judges, but sometimes the number two even becomes the number one, and that is the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I think the reason for that is in part, not that everybody's been thinking about that, maybe the way you have, but it just struck everybody that, you know, Bill Clinton promised to do it but didn't, and George W. Bush promised to do it and didn't, and Barack Obama promised to do it and did it, and And yet candidate Donald Trump promised to do it and did it. And I think in some respects, the moving of the embassy may not be the most significant of all the accomplishments by President Trump, but it's one that seems to resonate with so many of the people that think that this time they will go and vote for him again.
Well, that's true. And a lot of it has to do with the magic of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is Israel's capital city, and anyone who really knows the history or knows the biblical description of the history, the Jerusalem was the capital city. It's Israel's eternal capital for over 3,000 years. King David, King Solomon. These are stories that are just about a city and a people, and it's a rich history. And so anybody who really understands the importance of heroes like King David and King Solomon, and who thinks of Jerusalem and those magical golden walls that surround this city that were built by King Herod, it's a story that captivates the world. So that's Jerusalem, and we could talk about a lot of other accomplishments as well, such as Trump's recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
That's another
strategic area.
Yeah,
and the halting of financial assistance to the Palestinian Authority until they stop paying terrorists for every terror attack. You mentioned the terror attack when my 3-year-old son and I were wounded some years back. Well, those terrorists who shot and wounded us with AK-47 assault rifles were from the Palestinian Authority, one of their constituent terrorist organizations. And that particular attack, those terrorists are in jail. They've been in jail for many years, but their families still receive their salaries every month. And they receive salaries from the Palestinian Authority directly because of their terror attacks that they have committed. So that hasn't ended, but at least President Trump has made it clear that it would be morally incorrect for the United States to still be giving support to the Palestinian Authority despite their terrorist actions.
Very good. Let's talk about what is available at the website. We have a link to ShilohIsraelChildren.org, and it's the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. And I know that some of our listeners maybe have donated to it. So talk about what is available to some of our listeners when they go to that website.
Well, they can find out more about what the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund does. I tell the story all the time of the terrorist attack when my 3-year-old son and I were wounded, but there have been so many other terror attacks, and there have been thousands of traumatized children in the biblical heartland of Israel. So when we read about what the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund has done over the past 15 years and how we are literally healing the trauma of the terror victim children through our programs. So, it's just an amazing thing, and people can find out how they can partner with us in that process. We have over 2,000 children on our central campus in Shiloh. Over 2,000 children.
Very good.
And this is on an integrative therapeutic educational campus. We integrate therapy with education to heal the trauma of the children and to restore some of the lost innocence of childhood. So yes, of course, I would urge all of your listeners to go to the website, which is ShilohIsraelChildren.org. That's Shiloh, SHILOH, IsraelChildren.org.
And again, if you can just go to Point of View, we have a link there. Just click on the picture there of David Rubin. And just before we go, we oftentimes take trips to Israel, and we have another one planned for the spring of 2021. We hope that by that time, the pandemic will be over. But what has it been like for you with COVID-19 there in Israel? Because I'm well aware that it has really affected tourism and all sorts of people that would love to visit the Holy Land.
Well, it has been a tremendous challenge. Especially the fact that our therapeutic center was closed down for about a month and a half.
Wow.
And everything had to be done by remote, and the additional demand for our services as a result of the trauma, the psychological trauma of being in lockdown. And I should point out that in our case, it's akin to the patients with pre-existing conditions who have been having trouble combating the virus. Here we're talking about psychological pre-existing conditions of terrorism and war, and then in addition to that, the children have to face this. So what I say is this. Number one, we are determined to succeed. Despite all the challenges, we are back, and we are running ahead, not walking forward. We are moving forward at a rapid speed to increase our services and to get more support. And I'll tell you frankly, my opinion, based on everything that I'm reading, including the vaccine research that Israel is involved in, I think by the beginning of the 2021, we will be going back to normal, or at least some degree of normality. And Israeli tourism will be opening up again, maybe even before that. So I would say go ahead and plan your trip and get in touch with me ahead of time. We could have a morning in Shiloh where your group can come and visit the therapeutic educational campus, meet the children, and see all of our programs as well.
Yeah, the land of Joshua and Hannah and Samuel the prophet and all the rest.
That's right.
So if nothing else, David Rubin, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the next opportunity to have a conversation with you, and thank you for the information here about the Israel United Arab Emirates peace process and the peace treaty that has been signed. So thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues. Don't forget, of course, the Republican convention is tonight, and Land of Promise. We'll be talking about a number of issues tomorrow. Tim Scott, Steve Scalise, Nikki Haley, Donald Trump Jr., just a couple of the individuals that you'll hear from. But I thought we need a break from some of this news, and I really am looking forward to this next interview that we'll be doing the next hour. William Marty will be with us. He has been a professor at Moody Bible Institute I guess he was there for 37 years. Fascinating Bible studies on every parable. And I thought you would enjoy that, especially since a number of you actually teach the Bible. And this is a new book out that will really help you take some of those parables of Jesus and do a good job of trying to present those and teach and preach on those. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, when Jesus taught, he didn't always just teach in sort of a propositional, theologically way or exegete various verses. He often told stories, and those, of course, we call parables. And I thought this would be a book that would be very helpful to you. It is really designed either for your own personal use or for small group use, so I would encourage you to find out more about it. The book has just come out, and so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link so that you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. Published by Bethany House, and it is written by Dr. William Marty, who taught at the Moody Bible Institute for 37 years. Remember, he was teaching for some of the introductory courses for the incoming students there, and you may be familiar with some of his other books, which would be The Whole Bible Story, as well as The World of Jesus, The Jesus Story, and a number of others. But this book is entitled Fascinating Bible Studies on Every Parable. And Dr. Marty, it's great to have you on the program with us.
Well, thank you. It's my privilege. Glad to be here.
Let's, if we can, talk about the function of a parable, because Jesus was asked by his disciples at one point, why do you speak to people in parables? We see that in the Gospel of Mark, and he gives a very good answer to it, doesn't he?
Yes. The first time Jesus began to speak in parables, his disciples were quite surprised. They said, why don't you give a message like you did on the Sermon on the Mount? And so they said, we're confused. And Jesus made somewhat of a cryptic statement. He said, well, to you, those that I call insiders, it's been given to know the truths, the secrets about the kingdom of heaven, but to those on the outside, they can't understand. So parables were stories from everyday life. The Jews, Jesus' audience, would have been quite familiar with all of the stories that he told, but there was usually a little twist in them that would catch his listeners by surprise. But he told them to reveal truths to his followers about the kingdom of God. But those same parables that revealed truths to his followers actually hid them from his enemies. It wasn't because Jesus didn't want them to understand. It was because of the hardness of their own hearts that they couldn't understand. He says, you have ears to hear, but you don't really hear. You have eyes to see, but you don't really see. So basically, parables were stories from everyday life to teach truths about the kingdom of God that Jesus came to inaugurate.
And again, since they have lasted so long and since we use them so often, it is very good to have a book that summarizes those. You have a couple of Old Testament parables, but then about almost 36 of the New Testament parables broken in half: the nature of the kingdom and then the ethics of the kingdom. But let's, if we can, talk about, what, to use a big term, biblical exegesis, because in some respects with these parables, you've got to use the same kind of attempt to understand God's Word by putting it in the context. And the example I love to use is, a while back I was invited to speak in this Bible study, and before I started, all the men were gathered around the table, and they said, now, if you want, you can actually give a message on the prodigal son And I wasn't planning on it. And he said, well, the reason we wanted to do that is because we've had 4 different individuals come into this Bible study to teach on the prodigal son. And every single one of them came to a different set of conclusions or had different applications. And I was thinking, Dr. Marty, that in some respects that shows the depth of the parables and that you can really discern more biblical principles out of it. But I couldn't help in the back of my mind wondering if some of the principles being drawn out weren't very good principles. And so in some respects, the key to understanding into these parables, which I see as I look at your book and went through them, is to understand the context of the first century. And that helps you understand the context, and thus maybe we'll avoid some of the kinds of poor interpretations that some people have rendered to some of these parables, don't you think?
Yes, you're exactly right. I'm actually leading a Bible study right now on the parables. We meet in our garage because of the so-called pandemic, so we can do social distancing.
Right.
And one of the things that I have emphasized with the folks, and we do it every night, is that, every time we meet, is that you have to look at not only the historical culture of the first century, but you have to look at the context of the parable itself. And so I encourage people to read what's before and what follows the parable.
Right.
We've been talking about the parable of the shrewd manager, and it's in the context of the statement that the Pharisees love money. So Jesus is really using parables to rebuke the Pharisees for their greediness. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Context is very important. And that helps people to avoid allegorizing parables. There's a tendency to interpret all the points of a parable, but most parables only make 1, 2, or maybe 3 points in some cases.
Yes, and we need to take a break, but just before we do so, let me just mention that this is so structured to, first of all, have the parable, then a description of that parable, then there's a section on to reflect, and oftentimes there's anywhere from 5 to 7 questions, which for those of you who may be thinking about wanting to use this as a small group study, just as Dr. William Marty has been doing, you can do. Then there's a section on optional, which sometimes gives you some other thoughts. Sometimes that one is pretty extensive, sometimes fairly short, but it gives you some other verses to read, whatever that might be, to a little illustrate and maybe elaborate on that parable. And then at the end, a memory verse. So this is so well structured for not only personal study, but as you've mentioned on the front here, small group study. So I thought when we come back, let's pick off an easy one or two, the sower and the soils, maybe the wheat and the tare, some of those, which are easier, if to nothing else, because Jesus helped answer those questions. Then we'll get into a couple of the others in terms of the value of the kingdom and the consummation of the kingdom. Then we'll get into the whole ethics of the kingdom, and that's discipleship and reversal and prayer and grace and love and judgment and fruitfulness. And so if you've always been a little bit puzzled by some of these parables, or you've wanted to maybe have a resource to teach, I know our own class is going to be going through the Gospel of Matthew, and so there's quite a number of parables, both in Matthew and in Luke. Of course, we just mentioned one in Mark just a minute ago. And so these are going to be great resources, whether you're actually teaching through a book of the Bible or whether you maybe just wanted to focus on some of these parables and use these as an opportunity to teach about the kingdom. So we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. William Marty. The book is entitled Fascinating Bible Studies on Every Parable. It is published by Bethany House, just came out just a few days ago. Should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have an opportunity for you to order it both in paperback and Kindle. Matter of fact, if you're a small group leader, you might want to get multiple copies and pass them around and start your Bible study. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new study from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention documents what we already suspected. The coronavirus pandemic has adversely affected our country's mental health. Correspondent Alexander Nazarian summarizes the findings from a CD survey of 5,400 Americans. More than 4 in 10 respondents reported at least one adverse mental or behavioral health condition. More than 3 in 10 suffered from anxiety or depression. More than a quarter experienced symptoms of traumatic disorder. Many were using drugs or alcohol more heavily or even for the first time to cope with the epidemic. Now, many news reports accurately reported that 11% of the respondents said they seriously considered suicide, but that doesn't give the whole picture. If you look at the chart in the CDC report, you'll notice that more than a quarter of young people considered suicide in the last 30 days. All of these numbers and percentages represent higher levels of psychological distress compared to pre-pandemic levels. Anxiety symptoms, for example, tripled in their incidence compared to the same period last year. Even worse, the incidence of depression or post-traumatic stress disorder quadrupled. Columnist Jennifer Senior wrote about a Kaiser Family Foundation tracking poll showing a majority of American adults believe the pandemic is taking a toll on their mental health. More than 1/3 of Americans said it was interfering with their sleep. Also, 1/3 said they are overeating or not eating enough. All of this, she concludes, is causing a national slide into a sulfurous pit of distress. I believe the current circumstances provide an opportunity to provide our nation with true hope and encouragement found in the gospel and provided through individual Christian action and church outreach. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. William Marty, the author of the book Fascinating Bible Studies on Every Parable. And if you go to Matthew 13, of course, you have the parable of the sower and the soil, but you also have the wheat and the tares of the wheat and the weeds, the mustard seed, the leaven of the hidden treasure, and the pearl of great price, the fishing net. In some respects, as Jesus is teaching about this, he's teaching about the kingdom, also teaching about the obstacles when we proclaim the word of God. And so I thought we'd start with the easy one, the sower and the soils. Easy because, first of all, I think many people intuitively understand it, and Jesus also explains it, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And you're absolutely right about the parables in Matthew 13. They are parables that introduce the kingdom. It's somewhat of a unique chapter because there are 7 parables, and they follow almost one after another with a little bit of explanation in between. He began, as you mentioned, with the parable of the sower or the soils, and he tells a story about a farmer who went out to plant some seed, and he scattered it, and as they did in the first century, he scattered it all over the place. Some fell on a path, some fell in rocky soil, and some in among the weeds, and then some fell on the good soil. And what Jesus explained then, when his disciples asked him what he was talking about, was that the seed represents the proclamation of the gospel, the good news. And what was unique about the story is that, unlike what the disciples anticipated when the Messiah came, that everyone would accept the good news, Jesus says that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The seed that fell on the rocky soil was snatched away by those birds that Jesus later says represent Satan. The seed that fell on the rocky or the shallow soil grew for a while, but then it wilted under the hot sun in the Middle East. And then the seed that fell among the thorns was choked out, and this probably represents other concerns and motivations that people have. But then he says some fell on the good soil, and it brought forth 30 times, 60 times, and 100 times, which any of those would have been a remarkable harvest for a farmer. So he's not really trying to teach about different amounts of productivity, but he's just saying that you can expect an amazing harvest from the proclamation of the gospel. And what I find interesting, Kerby, is that when you look at the New Testament as a whole, you discover that the kingdom of God was being advanced to the world through the proclamation of the gospel. And it was the power of the gospel that convinced people to become followers of Christ. Paul wrote to the Colossians that he commends them because of the gospel that had been planted among them, had been advancing throughout the world. So that very first parable is crucial because it sort of sets the stage for the advance of the kingdom, and the kingdom is advanced through the proclamation of God's word.
You know, the other part of that is the wheat and the weeds, which is following that, because, again, some people might say, well, we'll just pull up the weeds. No, we don't. And anybody that knows anything about farming knows, first of all, you don't do that. But second of all, Jesus uses that to really answer the question, because one of the issues that surfaced in the Old Testament, you know, why are these bad people thriving? What about judgment? They were certainly thinking about that in the first century as well, in the church age. And so in some respects, again, it helps answer a question that we sometimes run into when we do apologetics or when we just do Bible 101, because people say, well, what about all the weeds out here? And Jesus sort of gives us an answer there too, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And what he's answering is he's not really correcting a misunderstanding about the kingdom, but he's explaining further what's happening in the advance of the kingdom. In the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Daniel and in chapters 2 and 7, Daniel prophesies that the kingdom of God is going to come, and when it comes, it's going to encompass the whole world. And so the Jews were anticipating, with the arrival of the Messiah and the coming of the kingdom, that everyone would immediately be in the kingdom, or if they were wicked, they would be judged. And Jesus says, no, that's not exactly what's going to happen, because the wheat and the weeds will grow together, and you can't separate them, but God can separate them, and he will separate them at the end of the age. And it's significant then that in Matthew chapter 13, the chapter closes with the last parable that Jesus told on this occasion, and it was the parable about the fishing net, where they caught good and bad fish, and then they separated the good fish from the bad fish.
Very much so. One other one I thought I'd just pick out, since we were at Matthew 13, is the mustard seed. Whenever I go to Israel, I always make sure I have a few in my pocket, mustard seeds that I've either purchased or something like that. And they really are struck by the fact, yeah, it really is pretty small there, you know. And yet the point he was making is this was really for the disciples, who were probably discouraged and confused, may also have prepared them for the future when they were going to be persecuted. And so what seems so small, this mustard seed, is going to grow into something very large. And so oftentimes when we show them what they grow into, the mustard tree, and where it came from, people are always pretty impressed. And so Jesus used that to get their attention as well, didn't he?
He did, exactly. And the mustard seed and the parable of the yeast go together. They indicate that the kingdom will start small, but then it will grow large, like a mustard seed or like leaven that works its way through the whole loaf of bread. And we see that even in the New Testament when Jesus' followers met in the upper room after his death and resurrection. This is in Acts chapter 1. There were 120 of them. And when you get to the end of the book of Acts, Paul is proclaiming the gospel in Rome. He's under house arrest. He's a prisoner. But the gospel has been proclaimed throughout the Roman Empire, and now there are thousands of believers. So the mustard seed that was very small has become this huge plant that encompassed the entire Roman Empire.
Very good. When we come back to the break, we'll do the ethics of the kingdom, but I thought just before we run out of this section, how about the wise and foolish virgins? Because in some respects, you can give us a little understanding of what a first century wedding was like and how in Matthew 25 we see that. Of course, you also have the sheep and the goats, which gets us back to like the parable of the fishing net. But what about that? Because in some respects, we need to understand what a wedding was like.
Yes. Do you want to do that now, or
sure?
Do you want to do
we
it
got
after?
About 2 minutes. I think you can probably do it in 2 minutes.
Well, in a wedding, it wasn't quite like the weddings that we have today, but there was this ceremony, but you didn't know exactly when the groom was going to come. So the attendants, the wise and foolish virgins, had to have lamps. And in this particular parable, some had prepared for perhaps a delay in the coming of the groom, and others hadn't. And so when the groom came, the wise virgins were ready for his coming. The unwise weren't. And, of course, Jesus applies that to whether or not people are going to be prepared for his coming. And you're wise if you do, and you're foolish if you don't, because his coming is inevitable, but you don't know exactly when the Lord will return.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, the second half of the book is on the ethics of the kingdom. So many great parables there as well. And if you find yourself saying, yeah, I'd like to get a copy of this book, it just came out last week, and that's why we wanted to feature it. And it is published by Bethany House, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. More than 200 pages. Like I said, about 36 of these parables broken into various categories. And when we come back, we'll talk about discipleship and prayer and grace and judgment and a number of other things in terms of the ethics of the kingdom. And it is written by Dr. William Marty, and you can find some of his other books there as well. 101 Fascinating Bible Studies, the whole Bible story. Matter of fact, there's an illustrated version of the whole Bible story and many other books by him as well. So we have information about him and about the book in our website, pointofview.net. You can go there and find that out. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of these parables that give us a perspective on the ethics of the kingdom. What does that mean, and how will we begin to live as kingdom followers in that kingdom? We'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. William Marty. The book is entitled Fascinating Bible Studies on Every Parable. And we're in a section here now on the ethics of the kingdom. Thought we'd focus on discipleship. And you talked about when you were a young Christian. I think all of us at one time or another sang the song, I have decided to follow Jesus. But in some respects, I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back, is really this idea that we see in Luke chapter 14, because it talks about a variety of different aspects of not turning back. So how was Jesus using that parable at the time?
I'm sorry, Kerby, I missed the parable that you were referring to.
The one on the tower builder and the warring king, in the first one, yes.
Yes. Well, he's using those in the context of his statement about the cost of being a disciple. And when he said that, if anyone wants to follow me, he must take up his cross and follow me. Of course, he was referring to you didn't literally have to die, but you had to basically give up your life. And then he uses these two parables to indicate that if you're going to follow Jesus, you need to thoughtfully consider the cost of it, because in the case of a man who's going to build a tower, he didn't realize that he didn't have enough resources to finish it, and so when he's unable to finish the tower, all of his neighbors are going to say he was a fool because he didn't consider the cost.
Yeah, count the cost.
Then the one with the warring king is that this king decided to go to war, but he didn't really consider the size of his army versus the size of the opposing army, and he would ultimately be defeated. That parable has a little bit of a hook in it, because it's implied that if you plan to go to war against God, you will surely lose. But again, the main point is you need to count the cost, and if you're going to become a follower of Jesus and there's going to be no turning back, then you need to give careful consideration to whether or not you want to make that decision.
So again, sometimes what we see is let's use this as an example, whether it's Luke 14, Matthew 13, whatever, we see these as disconnected sometimes as parables. And Jesus puts these all together because they're just different ways of looking at the same issue of counting the cost, no turning back. It's like turning the kaleidoscope. You're just getting a kind of a different turn. And so sometimes what I have seen over the years, Dr. Marty, is people will pull out one parable but not even put it in the context of the others, because you get a number of them coming kind of in rapid succession here. You have the cross, you have the builder, you have the king. All of them come together in a very significant way. We'll get to some of those when we get to the prodigal son and the lost coin and all that in just a few minutes, but those are important. It's another kind of good biblical principle of interpretation. Sometimes these parables all build upon each other, don't they?
Yes, they do, and I don't know if I can explain this quickly over the phone or not, but what you have in the Gospels, for example, in Matthew, in Matthew chapter 13, those are parables related to the establishment and how the kingdom is advancing in the world. And then Luke has a unique section that begins at about chapter 12, 13. And in this section, he has, I think it's like 17 parables. And all of these parables were taught by Jesus when he was on his way to Jerusalem, when he was making his last trip to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the parables in that section focus either on the cost of discipleship, which we just talked about, or God's love for the lost. And you mentioned the prodigal son and the lost sheep and so forth. So those are the two themes that run through this whole section in the parables in the Gospel of Luke. And so your statement's absolutely right.
Well, I just thought it was kind of interesting to see that. And another one, of course, is the shrewd manager. That is one that you see in Luke 16. And again, what you have is an individual that was dishonest, but someone else was shrewd. And sometimes people have trouble kind of sorting out Luke 16 when it talks about the shrewd manager. Can you help us out with that one?
Yes, we talked about that one last week in our Bible study that meets in our garage, and that is the most difficult parable to interpret, because this businessman had a manager, and he found out that his manager was cheating him. And so he called the manager in to give an account, and he said he was going to be fired. So the manager reduced the amount of debts that were owed to his employer. And so the question arises, was he still cheating his employer because the employer commends him?
Yes.
He says, well, you're wise because you're preparing for the future. So that's a bit of a puzzle. The way that some think that Jesus was simply using a bad example to teach a good point.
Right.
But there is another way to understand it, and it's the way that I understand it, is that the manager was not reducing the amount of money owed to his employer, but it was reducing the amount of his commission. So he wasn't actually cheating his employer. He was sacrificing his commission. And for that reason, then, the employer commended him and said, you are wise because you have prepared for the future. And then in the application of the parable, Jesus also makes the statement that you can't serve God and money. And obviously, the manager had decided that it was more important to serve God than money, and gave up his commission.
Yeah, but the principle you don't want to pull out of that is that you can be dishonest and then you can cheat your employer, and God's going to smile on you. And this is, of all the, I'm glad you said that, because that's what I would have said of all the parables, probably one of the ones where you just kind of scratch your head a little bit and go, I think I understand what Jesus is trying to say, but that is one of those kind of hard sayings of Jesus. And when you're talking about that, since we're talking about managers, there's the whole idea of watchful servants and the wise manager. That's, again, that concept of watchfulness and being watchful servants, and then the whole idea of a wise and wicked manager. So, again, we kind of have to sort that out, and a lot of that shows up in Luke 12 and also Matthew 24, doesn't it? And some of that, of course, gets with the return of Christ. But explain that, if you might.
Well, it's simply that a wise manager actually believed that the Lord was going to return. I mean, he's not referring to the Lord in the parable that the owner of the property and so forth was going to return, and the unwise manager didn't. And so when the owner returns, then he commends the wise manager, and he judges or he condemns the unwise manager, who was actually dishonest in his absence because he was using resources to make himself a profit.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Sure does. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. One of the other ones I thought I'd just mention while we're going to a break here is the thief, that coming like a thief in the night. And I love some of the places where you have the author's takeaway. If you live in Chicago, lock your doors at night. Of course, you live in Colorado now, but aren't you glad you live in Colorado right now and not Chicago? Because even in the last hour, we were talking about Chicago. So anyway, thief of the night, and this always gets you smiling, because if you live in Chicago, lock your doors. Of course, all of us do. And again, there's a section on reflect and some of the observations and memory verses. But we'll come back, and real quickly, we'll talk about the wedding feast, the great banquet. And of course, I guess we really need to do something in terms of the parables that relate to the prodigal son and those kinds of things. But again, if you find yourself saying, I would like to teach on some of these parables, and I'd like to understand a few of them that are a little bit complex and difficult to understand, that's why Dr. William Marty Marty has done such a good job of pulling this together. More than 200 pages published by our good friends at Bethany House. It just came out, and if you'd like to know more about it, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and we have an opportunity for you to order it if you'd like to. Paperback or Kindle, you perhaps should be able to find it in your local bookstore. It came out last week, and maybe it will now be in stock for you to get copies of it. Let's take a break, though. Again, we are working our way through some of the parables, some on the nature of the kingdom, some on the ethics of the kingdom. We'll come back with just maybe 2 or 3 more examples, but we hardly have covered all of them, and that's why you need to get a copy of the book. But let's take a break. We will continue our conversation looking at some of the other aspects of the ethics of the kingdom and how we live as kingdom people right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Stay for a few more minutes as we talk with Dr. William Marty about fascinating Bible studies on every parable. And I thought we might look at some of the parables related to salvation. The great banquet. Everybody had an excuse, so I think the theme there is don't make excuses for not accepting the Lord. And then the rich man and Lazarus, don't wait, it may be too late. So one of the excuses is, well, I got married, I got to deal with this, I got to look at a field. Or in the case of rich man and Lazarus, well, I'll just get to that someday. And it seems to me that Jesus is using some very striking parables to warn us that today is the day of salvation, right?
Exactly. in the parable of the great banquet, the host sent out invitations, and people responded and said that they were going to attend, but they don't have the kind of modern communications we do. So when it was time for the banquet, they had to send out another invitation. And when the invited guest received the second invitation, one person said, "Well, I just bought a field. I can't come. I have to try out the oxen." Well, it would be like buying a car without test driving at first. And another one said, "Well, I just got married." Well, marriages weren't scheduled at the last minute, and so it probably wasn't a conflict of interest. It might sound legitimate, but since he knew in advance about the banquet and he knew in advance about the wedding, he wouldn't have scheduled them both at the same time. So these were all excuses, and so the host, who was going to have the wedding banquet, he says, "Go out and invite everybody." And so they did that, and the servants came back and said, "There's still room." And he said, "Well, go out and invite some more, go into the highways and the byways." This would be like, go invite the street people, people who are outside the city, so that my house will be full. And like you said, Kirby, you're exactly right, that the point of the parable is don't make excuses, because it may be too late. And the point that I make, I think in the book, is you can summarize this by saying, if you're excluded from the kingdom, you have only yourself to blame. Don't blame anyone but yourself.
Sure. And again, I thought we would kind of wind down by looking at the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, because in some respects, even though those are always treated as separate, there is a sense in which those two parables build together. How so? Give us an understanding of that.
Well, Jesus is answering his critics. That's one of my favorite chapters in the gospel. It's Luke chapter 15, and has those three parables, and it's about the love of God. And Jesus was hanging around with the kind of people that the religious leaders despised, and so they criticized him. And so Jesus told three parables. He told the parable of lost sheep. The shepherd left 99 sheep to search for one. Then he told the parable of the lost coin. The woman lost one coin, and yet she took everything out of her house in order to find it. And I look at those as illustrations of the greatness of God's love and how reckless God wants us to be in telling others about his love. And then the chapter ends with the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. Some think that parable should actually be named the parable of the loving father, because his younger son takes his inheritance early, and he squanders it, and finally he realizes that he's made a terrible mistake, and he comes home, and instead of rejecting him, the father actually rushes out and meets him, and then orders his servants to prepare a celebration because his son has come home. And there's an old joke that you probably heard. There were two people who were unhappy about it: the fatted calf and the older brother.
Yes, right.
And so the elder brother probably represents the religious leaders who were resentful because Jesus was talking to the kind of people that they despised. But then the main point in the parable isn't about the elder brother. It's about the father and his incredible love for his son. And so it's a powerful illustration of the depth of God's love for people who are lost. And if anyone has ever had a family member, or perhaps a son who's been a prodigal, there's no reason why they can't come home, because God loves those kinds of people.
Let's see, we can real quickly go to one of our callers here in Georgia on the Good News Network. Dan, I think you were a student of Dr. Marty's. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I was in the ASP class in 1985. I just left active duty as a Marine officer, and I was in the class that we put bags over our head during the Song of Solomon. And
oh my goodness, that was when I was just getting started in my teaching career.
I can remember Dr. Marty saying when he was speaking at Founders Week between like a Dr. MacArthur and a Dr. Sweeting, he said, I feel like a piece of bologna between two slices of Wonder Bread. And I have to argue with that. Dr. Marty was my favorite and one of our best teachers, and I've taught the lessons that he taught me over the years. And I thank him for his faithfulness.
Very good.
Wow. Thank you, Dan.
Dr. Marty, I thought you'd enjoy that. One of your students from the early days.
I guess so.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thank you for calling. We're just about out of time, and I thought just before I run out of time, Dr. Marty, let's talk about how people can use this, because this is made for individuals to study individually, but you have a whole section on reflect, then some optional verses you might look at, and a memory verse. So this is actually intended as well to be used as a small group study. So if Dan wanted to use it in his study and take some of the things from his former teacher and go and teach it, you've made it available to put it in that format, haven't you?
Yes. Like you said, Kerby, it could be used either by an individual, and it could be used in a small group Bible study. One of my friends called me. I do have a few friends. Just a couple of days after the book came out and said, tell me how I can get them. And he wants to lead a small group Bible study of about 10 people. And so I gave him information on how to get copies of the book, and he plans to use it with his small group. It's really self-contained. You don't have to study other books or read commentaries and that sort of thing. I mean, you can use this for yourself, or you can use it with a small group with your Bible and the book, 102 Fascinating Bible Studies.
So again, just great material.
Yeah, and it's all set up, like you've mentioned several times. There's an introduction and a brief explanation, and then there are questions that they can use for themselves or for their small group.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View. Dr. William Marty's been with us. Fascinating Bible studies on every parable. Dan, thanks for calling in. I probably could have picked out a couple others that would want to say something nice about Dr. Marty, but I appreciate you getting through and calling. And that is all we really have for today. If you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things you've covered, you've posted a number of articles which are available to you, and that gets us into the whole issue of the peace process and some of the things that we discussed with David Rubin, including his book on Trump and the Jews. We also, of course, been talking with Dr. William Marty about fascinating Bible studies on every parable, and then all sorts of different articles that I think you will find helpful. This today is tonight the first day of the Republican National Convention. We'll give you a little bit of an overview, as we did last week with the Democratic National Convention, and if you have any comments or questions, you're free to give us a call as we start getting into some of the aspects of the policy procedures and some of the pronouncements and even all the things that are part of the platform. But that's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer and for Steve as the individual producing this program. We will see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.